This ship saw it all.
These ships don't stand berthed at the pier of a seaport. Some of them became famous in battle. Others just did their duty with honor.
Light cruiser Ajax was stricken from the Royal Navy and scrapped.
Their decks don't house museums of naval glory.
In the 1920s and 30s, all major naval powers, limited by international treaties, could not build new battleships and started to lay down large batches of cruisers instead.
But all of them became a part of naval history.
The Kaiser's fleet grew with ever-increasing speed.
They remain in our memory and are preserved as 1/42 scale models.
The history of the Russian Navy has many pages with the names of heroic ships.
The beginning of the 20th century marked a new era in naval shipbuilding. The age of powerful armored giants, battleships, began. Great Britain was the first to launch its HMS Dreadnought, which gave its name to a whole type of ship, thus involving other countries in the naval arms race. Russia also followed the trend. In June 1909, St. Petersburg, 4 dreadnoughts of the Russian fleet were laid down. They were the Sevastopol-class battleships, quite powerful for their time.
Battleship Petropavlovsk was one of these 4 ships. During her time in commission, she was renamed 3 times. The first name is closely associated with her predecessor, the ironclad ship of the Russo-Japanese War that perished near Port Arthur. The name Volkov is only known to a small number of specialists and enthusiasts. However, all who are interested in naval history know about Marat, a famous Soviet battleship that protected Leningrad during the years of the German siege, and they were all the same ship.
Petropavlovsk project was developed by the Technical Bureau of the Baltic Shipyard in St. Petersburg. In June 1909, the battleship was laid down at the same shipyard and completed within a couple of years. In 1914, she was commissioned and joined the Baltic Fleet. Compared to the last ironclads of the Russian Navy, the new battleship looked like a giant. She was more than 180 meters in length. Her beam was about 27 meters. The displacement was almost 26,000 tons, and the draft was more than 9 meters. The number of superstructures was minimal. The upper deck only had gun turrets, 2 smokestacks, 2 masts, and 2 conning towers. The one on the bow had a compact superstructure. Petropavlovsk's power plant included 25 Yarrow boilers and 10 Parson steam turbines. The boilers were located in the 4 boiler rooms between the turrets. They used both coal and oil. The turbines were installed in the battleship's 3 engine rooms. They actuated 4 propeller shafts. Under normal operation, the machines were producing 32,000 brake horsepower, but the maximum output could reach up to 42,000 brake horsepower. The Petropavlovsk's armor layout was unusual for that time. Having learned from the Russo-Japanese War, engineers decided to cover all the freeboard in armor. The main armor belt was 225 millimeters thick between the first and fourth turrets on the waterline. Its thickness thinned out on the bow and aft to 125 millimeters. The top armor belt, from the bow turret to the aft turret, was also 125 millimeters thick. Towards the bow, the thickness dropped to 75 millimeters, while the aft was not covered by the top belt. Petropavlovsk's primary armament consisted of 12 305mm guns developed by the Obukhov plant, installed in 4 triple turrets. For the first time, a Russian ship had ventilated and heated turrets. The secondary armament consisted of 16 120mm guns designed by Vickers. Battleship Petropavlovsk did not manage to demonstrate the power of her artillery in World War I. But after the October Revolution, she sided with the Bolsheviks and in 1919 engaged British ships. Eight destroyers of the British squadron that had arrived to the Baltic shores were forced to retreat hastily under fire from the battleship's artillery. Petropavlovsk also participated in other military operations during the Russian Civil War.
During the White Guard mutiny in the Krasnaya Gorka fort in 1919, battleship Petropavlovsk fired 568 305mm shells. You can imagine the scope of destruction inflicted by Petropavlovsk's primary armament salvos upon the fort. However, 2 years later, she opened fire at Krasnaya Gorka once again, only this time as a rebel, supporting the mutiny in Kronstadt.
After the Kronstadt events of 1921, the Bolsheviks hastily renamed the rebellious battleship. She was called Marat in honor of the French Revolutionary. In the 1920s to 30s, the ship underwent extensive repairs and serious modernization, which considerably altered her exterior. During the winter of 1939, battleship Marat participated in the Winter War, supporting the Red Army with her primary armament and dueling with the Finnish heavy shore batteries. The ship was fighting in World War II from day one, defending Kronstadt and Leningrad against German air raids. By the second night of combat actions, the crew of Marat had already shot down their first 2 enemy planes. By September, German troops approached the city and entered the effective area of Marat's primary armament guns. The battleship cracked down on the enemy with her devastating artillery fire. The German advance was stopped, but after the first days of the siege of Leningrad, Marat became a priority target for German pilots. On September 23, 1941, about 40 German aircraft simultaneously attacked Kronstadt. 2 half-ton bombs fell on the battleship during the raid. One of them hit the forward section of the ship and caused ammunition detonation. A 300-meter high pillar of smoke rose over Marat. One of the turrets literally flew up over the ship and collapsed on the breached deck. 326 crewmen died, including the captain and the commissar of the ship. As a result of the explosion, the forward superstructure was torn up to the second main turret, and the rest of the guns were disabled. The surviving crewmen heroically strove to save the ship, but without success. Marat sank. Only 3 meters of her board remained above water.
Germans decided that Marat was destroyed. However, only 5 weeks later, the 3rd and 4th turrets of the battleship opened fire on the enemy again. The battleship, which recovered her original name, Petropavlovsk, continued to fight the German troops until the siege of the city was lifted. After the war, Petropavlovsk served as a stationary training ship until 1953, when she was struck and scrapped, thus ending the service record of the battleship that made two of her names famous, Petropavlovsk and Marat.
In the early 20th century, the German Empire decided to challenge for the title of the strongest naval power, which traditionally belonged to the British. And as the Kaiser's fleet grew, an important role in it was assigned to fast and versatile cruisers. One such vessel was Kolberg, a protected cruiser and the lead ship in a series of 4.
To stand against the mistress of the seas, the Germans required more than just a powerful battleship fleet. They needed scout cruisers. In addition to this, the German Empire also had to defend their colonies. Being a practical people, the Germans decided to develop a multi-purpose cruiser. Since the start of the 20th century, one by one, Germany built several classes of these ships, officially called light cruisers. Kolberg was laid down in 1908 by Schachau Werke in Danzig, now Gdansk, and in 2 years she joined Germany's high seas fleet. German light cruisers were named after cities. On the stem, the ships proudly carried the emblems of Kolberg, Augsburg, Mainz, and Cologne. Later on, all major German ships were decorated with a relevant coat of arms, a tradition that has been preserved to this day. Cruiser Kolberg had a length of 130 meters, her beam was 14 meters, and the draft was almost 5.5 meters. The ship's total displacement was 4,915 tons. For the first time in German shipbuilding, a whole series of cruisers were fitted with turbines, which produced excellent results. The power plant produced over 30,000 horsepower, so the cruiser could reach a speed of over 26 knots. The primary protection for the cruiser was provided by her armored deck, whose slopes were up to 80 millimeters thick. The guns in the conning tower were also protected. There were plenty of debates about the armament of German light cruisers. While the British were starting to equip their light cruisers with 152mm cannons, the Germans continued to use 105mm guns, which were weaker but had a better rate of fire. Kolberg-class cruisers carried 12 of these guns. As well as the primary armament, the ships had 4 small-caliber guns and 2 submerged torpedo tubes. However, both were virtually useless in combat.
Before World War I, German admirals were sure that during battle, a larger number of guns and the crew's excellent battle skills would compensate for the small caliber of Kolberg's artillery. German cruisers were planning to defeat the enemy with a better rate of fire and shooting accuracy, but their first battles laid this theory to rest.
Less than a month after the war started, the Battle of Heligoland Bait took place. The tide wasn't turning in the favor of the German fleet. German cruisers were emerging from the pre-dawn fog one by one, only to come under massive fire from English ships. Kolberg's sister ship, Mainz, was sunk in a battle against light British cruisers, armed with 152mm guns. Cologne had even fewer chances. She ran against Admiral Beatty's battlecruisers, pummeled with heavy shells weighing half a ton each, conducting incessant fire, and proudly flying her flag, Colon vanished under the water. It was already the era of big guns, and when the two remaining ships of the class, Kolberg and Augsburg, were operating in the Baltic Sea, they avoided getting into battle against less speedy but well-armed Russian cruisers. In the end, Germany started rearming its light cruisers. At the end of 1916, it was Kolberg's turn. Instead of a dozen outdated old guns, she received 6 powerful 150mm cannons. One of the cruiser's last operations was an attempt to capture the Russian Baltic Fleet in Helsingfors, now Helsinki. Making use of the revolutionary disarray in Russia, the Germans decided to block Russian ships in the port of the Finnish capital and capture them. But after the heroic ice cruise of the Baltic Fleet, these plans were never realized. Meanwhile, it was March of 1918.
Eight months later, World War I came to an end. Germany was defeated. After the peace treaty was signed, cruiser Kolberg was commissioned into the French Navy as Colmar. In 1927, the ship was decommissioned, and 2 years later, former cruiser Kolberg was scrapped in Brest, France.